on Deputy Joan Burton.
Thank you, Lascan Corla. The bill that is before us, I suppose, is a just-in-case bill. In the best of circumstances, we would hope that this legislation would never have to be enacted, because, of course, the best Brexit for Ireland is actually no Brexit. The second best option is, as long as possible, a period of delay while the various complicated issues are sorted out. But what is certainly true is that up and down the country, and particularly in the north and in the border counties, there's a huge amount of real concern, apprehension and fear among people about what this is going to mean. And we are in a situation where this legislation is essentially country-to-country legislation between Ireland and the United Kingdom, much of which derives its structure from the fact that we have the common travel area, which predates by a long period of time Ireland and the UK's membership of the European Union in the 1970s, and it means that we have the possibility of having these bilateral or country-to-country arrangements with the UK, and the Labour Party will be broadly supporting the legislation, but we have a lot of queries about details and about the impact of some of the elements of the bill. Britain is at the moment slouching to exit the EU. There are games being played by Tories in particular, which are very damaging to Ireland. I think all of us who have seen the debates and the votes in the United Kingdom Parliament, to be honest, are dismayed both for the potential consequences for Ireland North and South, but also dismayed for our friends, neighbours, relations in the UK, in Scotland, in Wales and in England. It is for the Republic of Ireland and the island of Ireland certainly the greatest challenge since the bank crash. And we all know now, in hindsight, that what at the time, in 2008, seemed like a relatively simple thing which would happen, which would be costly and eventful, no one at the time, or very few at the time, appreciated how potentially catastrophic for a country a financial meltdown would be. And in fact, I recall being one of the people speaking about that in a situation where pretty much nobody else actually said anything, and where almost everybody else supported the fatal bank guarantee. So, having had that recent experience and the 10 long years it has taken us for a lot of people in the country to recover, for the 350 to 400,000 people who lost their jobs to come back into employment, I think we do have to use that experience to be on the alert for events that may be very damaging, either for parts of the country, for all of the country, or for individuals and families and institutions and businesses up and down the country. As I said, this is a just-in-case bill. We hope we won't need it, but I think it's almost certain we will need some elements of the legislation. I've had, over the last 2 years, many opportunities to meet through the British-Irish Parliamentary Association, as have had many other members of the Oireachtas, people from, in particular, the parliaments in Scotland and in Wales, who face, particularly in the case of Scotland, very similar challenges to what the island of Ireland faces. Wales, I think, has particular challenges, as we have in terms of the flow to and from of imports and exports, where we're using Wales as a land bridge along with England to get to the ports like Dover for imports and exports ultimately to and from Ireland. I think one of the things that we often fail to appreciate in this country is how much for many of the ardent Brexiteers, and they are very ardent, Brexit is a freedom issue. They actually often don't want to know the details of what is involved in dropping out of the European Union. They don't want to have detailed arguments about the technical impacts on different sectors. They feel that, and I've heard it's been said to me several times, if they've survived 2 world wars, even if there's a lot of disruption, they can face this as well. Personally, it's quite depressing at times to listen to this. This morning I heard Lord Putnam talking on RTE1, and he spoke in the context of being a member of the British House of Lords but living in the southwest, about how to some extent this is a post-colonial moment for the United Kingdom. And if we, though, fail to understand sufficiently the arch-Brexiteers and their point of view, I think that equally they fail to understand the enormous positive difference that the European Union membership has made to Ireland since we joined in the early 1970s. Just mention a few points where being part of the EU transformed our national landscape. And in fact, much of that carried on in a very favourable way into Northern Ireland, and also was part of the reason why ultimately we were able to find and work on a solution like the Belfast Agreement. I mean, if you think about women's rights, rights for people with a disability, general working rights for men and women, environmental standards and environmental consciousness, farming, economics in a general sense, funds that have supported, for instance, education and training to allow Ireland to upskill and to improve its levels of education, where countries like Portugal spent a lot of their funds in relation to transport infrastructure. Ireland, of course, historically, correctly, spent a vast amount of funds on upgrading our standards of education and training and qualification for people right across the country, so that now we probably have one of the highest population levels of graduates in the EU and possibly in the world. And to be honest, some of that might have happened, but it has happened in a much faster way as a consequence of our membership of the EU. It may well be that in the United Kingdom, areas like women's rights were far more advanced. And therefore, people in the United Kingdom who are leavers essentially don't have the positive association with the European Union that people in Ireland tend to have. And it's not a non-critical association, but it is just to recognise the positives that have been enabled. And I have to say, in terms of attending as a minister in 3 different governments down the years, I've attended various European Union meetings, and for somebody like me who was raised in a Labour socialist Republican tradition, there is something really moving from a historical point of view to be sitting at the table on an absolutely equal basis with the United Kingdom, given our long history with the United Kingdom. And it's, I think, something that is not sufficiently understood by those in the United Kingdom who are arguing for a dropout from the EU and who are arguing for leave. 2 weeks ago, I was part of an all-party delegation to the new United States Congress on its opening day about 2 weeks ago. Myself, Deputy Francis Fitzgerald, Deputy O'Snoddig, the Cathaoirleach of the Seanad, Senator O'Donovan and Senator Mark Daly. And that was one of the first, as I understand it, in some time, all-party delegations from the Oireachtas to go to the United States Congress and to basically talk to our friends, particularly in the Irish American Congress, on Capitol Hill about the dangers and threats that Brexit potentially poses for Ireland. And I think the discussions that we had were very interesting. For instance, as well as meeting the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, the most powerful committee in Congress, Congressman Neil, who is also the co-chair of the Friends of Ireland in the American Congress, along with Congressman King from the Republican side. We also met people like Congressman Boyle, who had put forward a motion to acknowledge the interests of Ireland in the context of Brexit, but also to query that if the United Kingdom came forward to do a trade deal with the United States, which has been spoken about as something that could happen very quickly, that in fact congressmen and congresswomen on the Hill would be cognizant of the fact, if that's the case, that in fact the United Kingdom had in fact perhaps, and we hope it won't, but that it may have put some stress, if not endangerment, on the Belfast Agreement. And I think that's very important that our friends in the United States from across the political divide should be aware, having been so much a party, as was the European Union, to the Belfast Agreement, that a Brexit which puts a strain, stress or endangerment and risk on the Belfast Agreement is not in the interests of anybody on this island, but it's also not in the interests of the United Kingdom itself. And, you know, people like Congressman Boyle should be congratulated for the degree of interest, not only that they've taken, but that they've expressed in Congress and in committee in relation to the interests of all of Ireland. One of the issues that they raised with us is the political reality in the States at the moment, which is that in the States and in much of the world, the atmosphere and now is not the time for trade deals. Trade deals are viewed, for reasons we all understand, with grave suspicion by a lot of people who feel they risk undermining their standard of living and their employment prospects. So what we were being told was that the chances of a trade deal being entered into very rapidly, as has been suggested by some of the leavers, that this might happen inside a couple of months of the United Kingdom exiting, that this would be very unlikely in terms of both the priorities of the United States, which is a very close ally of the United Kingdom, and everyone recognised and acknowledged that, but nonetheless, the realpolitik of the United States at the moment is that there are other pressing priorities, but that also trade deals are very complex issues which typically take many years. While you may have an agreement in principle to go into a trade deal process, it is likely that striking a trade deal with all of the detailed negotiation and the quid pro quos that are involved would in fact take a significant period of time. We know the Canada deal is often cited as being one which happened relatively quickly, and we all know that that was many a long year before it was finally agreed. The other issue that is difficult in this context, of course, for the United Kingdom in particular, but it certainly may have knock-on repercussions for ourselves, particularly in relation to areas like beef. And I would be very concerned what might happen in terms of our beef industry. And that is, when and if, and hopefully it doesn't, Britain were to drop down to third country status, we don't know exactly what then would happen. We know that the British have indicated that they wish broadly to favour Ireland, and there's the basis in this legislation, if you like, historically relating to the Common Travel Area. However, the WTO rules are very clear that third countries, if they extend facilities to other third countries, they may have to give that to every other third country. And there is no clarification on that. That would obviously be something to be negotiated. And again, as I say, we hope that that may not happen. I also think as well, in relation to what's been happening in the UK, that in many ways, given the difficulties for Scotland and Wales, it is a moment of British nationalism. What I do think though is needed in the Republic of Ireland is an actual Brexit fund to provide for people who may be at risk of unemployment, and to provide for upskilling, support for employment, return to education if that's what becomes necessary. Again, I'm saying we hope that this doesn't happen, but we would certainly like to see clarity in relation to something like a Brexit jobs fund. At the time of the crash, when we came into government, I think something like £500 million extra, even in very straitened times, was made available in the context of the dreadful unemployment situation. There are a number of questions, I think, which arise from some of the proposals that have been hinted at. Last night, for instance, on RTE, we saw coverage of the new entry booths and stalls at Dublin Airport, at Dublin Port, I should say, for trucks. We haven't really heard any detailed explanation of how that's going to work. I know in Dundalk, I saw it myself not too long ago, that the old customs premises has now been completely refurbished, but we've no idea how many people are actually going to be employed and what exactly they're going to do. We also know as well, and people along the border would know this particularly, that up to the time of about the year 2000, there was a very active business in customs clearance agents, or whatever it is you might want to call them nowadays. Those jobs basically disappeared in the context of open borders. It would now appear that at a minimum we will have very much more intensive requirements in relation to documentation, invoicing and other information that traders and hauliers will have to give in the context of movements to and from the European mainland to Ireland and to the United Kingdom if they're coming to Ireland. So I think we need some explanations of what the expectations are now in relation to that. And clearly, any support that is made available for businesses would be very welcome. But again, businesses don't really know yet. We've seen references to farm support going from 15 to 25,000, but people are still in the dark as to how this will work. We also know as well we have a lot of small businesses, family-run businesses in the agri-food business, and one way or another there's going to be an awful lot more documentation that small businesses, self-employed people will have to complete, and they will need appropriate support. I would also ask the Minister as well, in relation to the section on taxation, which we'll get an opportunity to discuss in detail in the committee, and that is in relation to the chapter on value-added tax. The proposal there is to have, for instance, postponed accounting on VAT for all imports registered for VAT in Ireland, and a modification of the proposed accounting scheme. Now, fine up to a point, but how are we going to avoid massive smuggling if, for instance, VAT at the point of entry is no longer being collected, but instead is being collected, I would say from this, sometime later when VAT returns are being made, and those returns in turn may be delayed. I don't have any difficulty in principle with that, but what I do want to know is if material is coming in here, and if in fact you have traders who don't then fully record it because it's coming in without any VAT type record until some months later. How do we avoid potentially significant losses? The Minister and the Government need to explain this, because traders and businesses also need to know what's this practical impact going to be on VAT returns, and how are we going to deal with that? Again, we have quite a number of arrangements which are now being specified on a country-to-country basis in tax matters with the United Kingdom. We do need some detailed explanations of the implications of those. As I said, we support the bill, but we need to address the implications. Unfortunately, in this legislation, doesn't specifically account.
Thanks for reminding me.
Sorry,
it
doesn't specifically mention. It doesn't specifically mention workers' rights. Okay. And again, I would ask the Minister if the Minister could come forward and explain that.
Now move to Deputy.